Talking Churchill. Joining me today is Professor Richard Toye from the University of Exeter. And today we're going to be exploring the notion of Robert Rhodes James's book, Churchill's Study in Failure, which is a very interesting book written by Robert Rhodes James, which supposes that if you imagine that Winston Churchill got hit by a bus in 1939 before the Second World War, that actually his career wasn't that impressive. Richard, what do you think about this?
Well, I suppose it's worth reviewing why Rhodes James made that argument, and clearly what he was saying was that for a long time Churchill had obviously failed during the 1930s to get support for his views on rearmament, and that his career over a longer period had not really been one of any great consistency. It had been sort of more about personal advancement for Churchill as a kind of career politician, that he'd gone from issue to issue. He'd had ups, but he'd also had serious downs, like the Gallipoli, and so that if the story had stopped in 1938 or 1939, Rhodes James argued that the story would be really one of personal tragedy for Churchill, somebody who had been a very interesting and colourful figure, but had not really achieved a great deal, and that in spite of the clear force of his personality, his personality characteristics had not been sufficient by that point, at any rate, to bring him supreme power.
Do you think as well in the 1930s, what do you think the effects of his support for keeping India in the British Empire was? Do you think that was one of the issues that also sort of undermines his legacy if it stops in 1938?
Well, certainly that was something which had a campaign which had occupied Churchill an enormous amount in the early 1930s up to 1935. He had simultaneously, of course, started to take an interest in the threat posed by Nazi Germany as well. But it's certainly true, as David Reynolds has pointed out in his book on Churchill's Second World War memoirs, that the story of India is very much neglected in that first volume of Churchill's memoirs, The Gathering Storm, and the story is all presented as being about warnings against appeasement and campaigning for greater rearmament spending. And so I think that the degree to which that failure was really undermining Churchill seriously by the late 1930s is debatable. Actually, sort of things had moved on. But I think it's clearly true that Churchill had not been spending as much effort on that what we now think of as the central issue of his political career, as the legend, which indeed he himself cultivated, would actually suggest.
Of course. Well, as a component of Robert Rhodes James's sort of argument is that essentially history would almost forget Churchill. Again, like you said, that he was a sort of eccentric, but not a sort of significant British political figure if the story starts in 1938 or 39. And do you think that that's true?
Well, I mean, I think maybe what he was saying more precisely was that we would remember him, but as a kind of an interesting failure rather than as some great hero. And so I think that what I would emphasise is that Churchill, by this point, of course, had written and published an enormous amount already, had given quite impressive speeches in Parliament, some of which he had published by the late 1930s as well. And so I think that if Churchill had died in 1939, subsequent historians would certainly be forced to turn to Churchill as a source of evidence. And remember that up until this point he'd also created and generated a huge archive. Now we have to assume, perhaps we can assume that had he died in 1939, that archive would still have been preserved and that it would actually be a very important source for historians. So perhaps, we've got to remember that by 1939, or by September 1939, there was in fact a popular campaign, a kind of a Bring Back Churchill campaign, that the failures of appeasement were being perceived, and that so actually what people might have argued was, isn't it sad that Churchill died in 1939? Sort of what a terrible missed opportunity.
That's true, and it wouldn't be seen as particularly framed in such a sort of failure, or in a sort of as a failure, I should say.
Yes, I mean, I think that he was somebody who clearly had the capacity to capture the public imagination in some way. Now, he kept, during the 1930s, as Rose James points out, he kept building himself up again and achieving, looked as though he was on the brink of success, of sort of getting back into office, and then had a tendency to throw it all away. For example, with his attitude over the abdication crisis, which he himself in his memoirs sort of said, I kind of threw it all away in a sort of a single moment. And so actually what contemporaries noted about him, or some of them did, was that he had all these setbacks, and yet he remorselessly kept building back. As soon as he was knocked down, he did get up again, and he just carried on.
And that's remarkable in and of itself, his sort of will to keep pushing forward, even though he's repeatedly knocked back in the 30s. And that's a part of the testament to how he eventually becomes a prime minister ultimately.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think how would we remember him if he'd been knocked over by a bus in 1939?
I think that you're absolutely right. I think that his sort of legacy would be almost, and his archives would work as a sort of historical center to understanding the first half of the 20th century. And people would still consult his papers, particularly his memoirs about the First World War. And in some ways, his memoirs about the First World War have been overshadowed by his memoirs of the Second World War. And of course, Robin Pryor has written a very sort of brilliant book on Churchill's World War I memoirs, but I think that he would be taken as a more central figure to the First World War, perhaps in the Second World War. And you would see his legacy and the effect of his memoirs sort of effect on the historiography of the First World War in a much more obvious way than we see it now as well. So I think the way I sort of would look at this, if he was taken out of the picture, is as a historiographical source and sort of through a historiographical lens.
Here's a final thought. If he'd been killed in 1939, then Randolph Churchill, his son, who did in fact write the first 2 volumes of the official biography of Churchill, which came out in the 1960s, but then died and was unable to complete it, was completed by Martin Gilbert. Had Winston died in 1939, then Randolph might have been able to write the entire official biography.
That's true. He would have had time and space to write the official biography, and who knows? He also still had a sort of political career to some degree, and maybe the fact that if his father was out of the picture, maybe his political career may have been more prominent than it was.
Maybe Randolph would have escaped from Winston's shadow and would have become a great political success.
In the same way that Winston escaped from Lord Randolph's political shadow. Thank you for joining us on Talking Churchill.